Yeah, so that is probably enough time to allow people to come. People will be joining throughout, but we can get started with this webinar. So I would like to start with a couple of technical announcements. So if you're joining this webinar as a participant, you're muted and your camera is off, but you will be able to participate in the session actively by asking questions. There will be a Q&A session at the end where you can ask questions directly to our speakers via the chat. We have our moderator Karazin, who you saw already in the beginning, who will make sure that we don't miss anything that is posted in the chat. So I would like to welcome all of you to our webinar series, Life as an Activist, where we will focus on the realities and challenges of democracy activism around the world. As you know, they are myriad and they are very different, and we wanted to really spotlight that. And so we've sort of declared that November is Activism Month here at Democracy International. So each week this month we will have a webinar on a different part of the world and on a different topic. Today the session is on Thursday because yesterday was a public holiday in many countries, but starting next week you will be able to join us every Wednesday at the same time, 5:30 to 7 in the evening, Central European time, here in Zoom or on our website, democracy.community. Where you can follow the sessions live as well, and where you can rewatch them after they have taken place. So as I mentioned, every session in this series will focus on a different region and on a different field of democracy work. And as I'm sure you all know, activism and even democracy itself can look wildly different in different contexts. And our idea with this was to really give you an idea of the variety of democracy, of shapes of democracy out there, the variety of activism out there. And who knows, maybe inspire you to become an activist yourself or to get active, to get in touch with some of the people who we are highlighting this month. And before we get to our first topic, before we really dive into that, I would really like to thank Engagement Global and the Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development of Germany, as they are sponsoring these sessions. And so because of that, they can take place. Yes, our first webinar starts with an extremely challenging topic. It's maybe one of the most difficult ones we will talk about this week. So we haven't made it easy on ourselves. We will focus really on some key challenges for the future of democracy activism, namely how can we engage young people to become more active in policy making? How can we fight against backsliding of democracy? And of course, we were turning, as you all know, who are joining us here, our attention to the Black Sea region today, where we, of course, will also discuss the crucial question of the destructive war in Ukraine. What has that meant for democracy in the region? How has it spilled over into different countries around there? What has it meant for the democracy developments that have taken place in Ukraine? And what can we do? How can we become active? And how do activists in the region and in the country deal with the challenges, with the very real and very difficult challenges that this poses? So I'm very pleased to welcome our speakers. We have three very interesting guests today. In no particular order, I would like to introduce to you Sasha Zuryan, a Ukrainian activist who currently resides in Georgia. She will share insights about World of Tolerance as a youth organization that creates all kinds of different spaces, offline and online, where young people can exchange their experiences, learn from each other, and really get inspired to do something with democracy, to get democratic citizens and to become active. She is also a specialist on civil society, and we'll also talk a little bit about shrinking civic space in Georgia and in the region. Our second speaker is Anna Proskurina, the academic project and communication officer at Democracy International. She's an expert on direct democracy and will give an overview on the developments in Ukraine before and after the war, the impact of the war, and of course, direct democracy instruments available in the rest of the region. And then finally, I would like to welcome Dr. Yuliyana Bidenko. She is an associate professor and curator of the master's program at Karazin Kharkiv National University. She is also, since 2023, a senior visitor research fellow at the Center for Eastern European and International Studies in Berlin, and has worked has worked extensively as an author of the Ukrainian annual country report for the Nations in Transit report by Freedom House, among many other things. I'm shortening the bio here quite a lot. I would like to wish all three of you a very warm welcome. And I am giving the word, I will give the word to each of you now for a short introduction on the topics that you will speak of. Afterwards, we will have some time for questions as well. And so I would like to kick this off with Dr. Bidenko. Thank you very much for joining us. Can you give us a short input on the state of democracy in the region and the background of the countries and the challenges that we are today dealing with? Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline, for this introduction. And I think, it's an easy topic to discuss, the future of the activism in the region. But I would like to start with showing some figures about the state of democracy and probably the development of civil society in this particular region. There are still a lot of discussions among scholars whether it is correct to probably label this region somehow, or put it in some geographical framework, because we used the term post-Soviet states, post-socialist states, and of course there are some geographical orientations here to call it Black Sea region, but probably it is more correct to say about the divisions in regard the democratic, non-democratic, authoritarian states there, because there are a lot of different tracks for different countries. And actually, thank you for mentioning my participation in creation and editing the last year Nations in Transit report by Freedom House, because they also try to trace the democratic developments within the region. And we can see here that it's not only the countries of particular Black Sea region, namely Georgia, Ukraine, Russia, for example, or Romania, but there are also Balkan states and Eastern and Central European states. And we can see here that very few of them succeeded to achieve great democratic progress and leave some, I would say, so-called leak of hybrid regimes. What does it mean? It means that actually most of these countries, they combine democratic institutions and practices with some non-democratic or less developed practices, namely in the field of, let's say, fight against corruption, or probably the transparency of national government. But what is interesting here, if we look at the kind of indicators, what typically used by different organizations to measure democracy in different countries, we can see that in this region, even where the national democratic governments has lowest kind of ranking, or for example, corruption is really high, there are some spots for civil society. So we can say that probably in any country, the civil society and the activism, grassroots activism by young people, it's still under development, and it is leaving room for hope for me. But what is interesting here, when we talk in particular about civil society, I would like to draw an attention to civil society organization sustainability index. You can use it for your research, for example, or to track the dynamic for a particular country. We can see different trends for the Black Sea region. The greener country is the more developed civil society there. It's some explanation for the map, and you can see that probably the most of countries, namely Ukraine, Georgia, Romania, and Balkan states, they have more or less equally developed civil society, but it's not so much developed as in the countries of the Central Europe and Baltic states. And what is about democracy in Ukraine, we can see from the numerous opinion polls there in Ukraine that support for democracy steadily increased during past 10 or 15 years. And it is very significant that despite all the work toll, people still believe that democracy will be the most desirable system for Ukraine. And if we are talking about the work trends, we can see there are no particular divisions between Ukrainian regions and even the age groups in their support of fully functioning democracy as a future for Ukraine. And probably it is very important to say that when people are asking what you would prefer more, the strong leader who is not limited by parliament, by other institutions, or would you prefer a democratic political system? Ukrainian people are still supporting democracy more. And what is interesting and puzzling for all my colleagues here, that despite the huge support for military forces of Ukraine, people still believe that probably military rule or military regime wouldn't be the best choice for Ukraine for future. And actually, to talking a bit about civic participation before the full-scale invasion, the level of awareness, of public awareness, how people could take part in public life, it was steadily increased before the war. And probably it is my hypothesis that it created a ground for this resilience, which Ukraine demonstrate more than 600 of days since February 2022. But what is about public participation and volunteering in the war circumstances? Actually, most of people, they said that they haven't an ability to take real part in their community life during this last year. But when it comes to volunteer themselves to make their own efforts to support, for example, IDPs or military forces, or abandoned pets, or to take part in some community actions, about half of Ukrainians, they are volunteering, and up to 6% they are doing it on a daily basis. How people also taking part in this public life, most of people switching to Ukrainian to demonstrate that they belong to these political nations, but the huge number of Ukrainians, they are donating money to army forces, they support internally displaced people, they are hosting or assisting those who arrive to their communities fled from the war zones, and also some of them join territorial defenses. Some students did already from Karazin National University. Others joined the army forces voluntarily, but this support of the Ukrainian resilience is really huge. And what is the most optimistic here for me, that actually most of people, 82%, they are going to take part in public lives of their communities in the future. So people do not only believe that democracy is very important for them, but they see themselves as the participants of these processes, especially within their communities. And what is interesting here, that of course young people, they are the most active group here. And I can say from my own experience that probably young people really see themselves much more than during past 10 years than active members of their communities and active members of the university groups, as active members of the I would say the society in general. So I'm finishing here and would like to say that Of course, Ukrainian civil society is not perfect. It faces with numerous dilemmas and problems and issues. One of them is the lacking of communication with the central government, the local governments in some particular communities, and of course, lacking of sustainability. Especially, it is very important when it comes to financial viability of civil society. And finishing by these data, Ukrainians are not idiots. Of course, they understand that their country is not fully democracy right now, but they can say that country is moving towards democracy, and it is more than 60% now who can say that we are under the progress, and we are taking part together to make it kind of real. But what is interesting here, and probably I will pass the ball to other speakers, that despite all this optimism, people are not so much believe that they have instruments which allow them to make a huge impact on policy making now, and probably there are problems with the instruments which are used now or have been used in Ukraine during past years. So thank you for your attention, and here are my students who joined the Ukrainian army, and here is a windowless building of Karazin University, but still it's also part of our resilience that we are keeping to teach, we are keeping to study, and we are still standing as a community of those who believe in democracy. I'm teaching the course of democracy and civil education together with IFES, and I could say that more and more students, they engage in these educational and practical processes in Ukraine. So thank you. I will stop here and pass the floor to other speakers about the instruments they use.
Yes, thank you very much for making this link between the war in Ukraine and the democratic system there. Again, once very clear. We will certainly talk more about it later. Yes, we would like to now welcome Anya Proskurina, our colleague here at Democracy International, who can talk a little bit more. As we saw from Dr. Bidenko's presentation, people believe in democracy, but they do not necessarily feel that they have enough chances to influence democracy. So Anna can now tell us a little bit more about direct democracy and participation instruments available to people in Ukraine and in the region as a whole. Welcome, Anna.
Hello, everyone. Yes, exactly. So as Yulia mentioned, people in Ukraine do not necessarily feel that they have enough tools for participation. And I think with my presentation, I'm going to touch a little bit on how direct democracy is or is not there for people to use. And the several things that we need to know about before speaking about actual existing laws is that firstly, the laws we are talking about or will be talking about are the recent laws adopted in 2021. And before that, for quite some time, Ukraine had no direct democracy legislation, as previous one was unconstitutional. And the second thing we need to know about the direct democracy in Ukraine at the moment is that, of course, due to Russian invasion of Ukraine, no direct democracy votes are possible in Ukraine in the current situation by constitutions or by electoral laws. And this, of course, includes the elections. But now I think we can move to the existing laws in Ukraine. And there is an instrument of mandatory vote triggered by constitution, but we're not going to talk about it today. Today, we are focusing on the instruments available for citizens, which are citizen initiative and veto initiative. The first one, citizen initiative, is a vote on any matter of nationwide significance. And the second one is to abrogate an existing law or its provision. What we also need to know about this is that both of these laws, citizen initiative and veto initiative, they are only regulated on a national level, so there are no local level initiatives in Ukraine. There are, of course, certain issues that cannot be voted upon by people according to constitution or this law. This includes the protection of fundamental human rights, question of sovereignty, territorial unity, but also the issues that are referred to by constitution or by Ukrainian laws to the competence of law enforcement authorities, prosecution office, or judicial authorities. And we will talk about this peculiarity a little bit later. And here are some numbers. So to trigger a vote, people have 90 days to collect 3 million signatures, which is a bit over 10% of the eligible voters in 2021, so before the full-scale war. And additionally, there are other restrictions. So the signatures needs to be collected in at least 2/3 of territorial regions of Ukraine, with some minimum of 100,000 signatures in each of these 2/3. There are also participation approval quorums. So 50% of eligible voters need to take part in a vote for it to be valid. And to approve the question, 50% or more of people who participated need to vote yes. And here is probably the major trick in this whole law. The vote on issue of nationwide significance is only a consultative vote. The abrogation of law or part of this law is binding, however. I will switch to analysis of this law a bit later. Now I just want to show you the whole process that initiators need to go through in order to initiate a vote. So people need to have an initiative group. The group should consist of at least 60 people. They need to hold a gathering of at least 300 people that vote on initiative group, and also at the very same day they vote on the question of the referendum. This initiative group files the document from the gathering to the Electoral Commission that has a certain period of time to approve it. If the vote is approved, if the request for a signature collection is approved, the initiative group has to collect 3 million signatures within 90 days with already mentioned territorial restrictions. After that comes signature verification. So the signatures needs to be filed to the Central Electoral Commission, and they have 14 days to verify the signatures. If the Central Electoral Commission says it's a go, the signatures are correct, the vote will be scheduled no later than 60 days from the approval. So the campaigning period is very short, only about 60 days. When the vote takes place, already mentioned 50% participation and approval quorums take place. And as a result, if the vote is approved, if the issue is approved, either the law is abrogated or the respective authority considers the issue that people were talking on. And now, if we had a bit more time, I would say put thumbs up or thumbs down. What do you think? It's a good or bad practice? I don't know if we can still do that, but I think I will be anyhow moving on and say why we do believe it's not the best practice. Sorry, I think this is the wrong slide. Yeah, so the group, as I said, have very limited period of time to collect such a huge amount of signatures, and these 90 days are given not only to collect signatures in a specific way, but also to do all the bureaucratic work before filing the signatures to the Central Electoral Commission. And if one also keeps in mind the territorial restrictions, this is already kind of predetermines the initiative to fail, also because it is impossible to collect signatures online, so it's only on paper. Then the second issue would be the phrasing of the issue of nationwide significance is pretty controversial. In the documents, it's never specified what are the indicators that show the issue is of nationwide significance, and it is also never mentioned that any issue that is not in a restricted section can be an issue of nationwide significance. So it gives some space for the Electoral Commission to turn down any initiative proposal on the grounds that it's not of nationwide significance. People of Ukraine are not allowed to initiate a vote on the issue that is in the competence of law enforcement authorities, which basically means that, for instance, any law passed in peaceful times that are designed to give more power for military or police structures cannot be overruled by people. And what is important to mention, this is not a constitutional restriction. So this is the restriction contained in the 2021 law. The second issue is the only initiative team is allowed to collect signatures, which is, of course, a limited group of people. The campaigning period is very short, only 60 days from the announcement of the vote, which, of course, doesn't allow the proper flow of information. In the way this legislation is designed right now, it empowers already powerful actors with significant financial possibilities and broad access to informational platforms and not to ordinary citizens to actually put issue to a vote. These referendums, these votes on citizens' initiatives cannot be held together with elections, which in combination with this high turnout and approval quorums are almost impossible to reach when the votes are not held together with elections. And in general, participation and approval quorums are generally criticized in the world, but especially so when this is the unbinding issue. So the quorums and signatures needed for launching the vote are very high, and then the result is not even secured. Sorry, I have something. But I also, as Ukrainian, always stay hopeful. And with this part, I want to actually voice some things that have been really vocal in Ukrainian society. For example, there is a strong demand for local referendum law. As I mentioned before, this is not existing at the moment. However, before the full-scale invasion, Ukrainian government has been working on a strong local referendum law. This would not concern regions or cities, that would concern local communities and would give them a strong power. And even during the full-scale invasion, local communities that are already quite a strong entity within Ukrainian system, they voiced their need for such a strong tool. I know a lot of Ukrainians and civil society organizations are voicing a need for constitutional reform after the full-scale war. And I, of course, firstly strongly hope that that would include the review and reform of constitutional restrictions for referendum. But also, I really hope that in the process of reformation, at least partially, we will take the Chilean approach, and the constitution will be reformed together with the citizens and civil society organizations. And lastly, I think it speaks for themselves, but I believe the revision of existing referendum laws is really needed. And finally, I want to briefly touch upon direct democracy tools in two other countries of the region, one being Georgia. And there are two tools available in Georgia. One is a top-down, initiated by the power of parliament, authority referendum, and citizens-initiated referendum. Authority referendums are triggered by prime minister, and their nature is only consultative, so it's not a binding vote. When we speak about citizen initiatives, they only can be held on the issue of particular importance for Georgia, but they cannot be held, which is an interesting, on the ratification and denunciation of treaties and international agreements. Again, some numbers, there are at least 200,000 signatures needed to launch a vote, and the time frame for collection is 3 months. Again, there are the same as in Ukraine, turnout and approval quorums. The important thing is that after the collection of the signatures, president is appointing the referendum, and the president can refuse to hold the referendum if they provide a well-grounded reason for it. And lastly, some direct democracy instruments in Bulgaria. So there are 3 instruments available, one of which is Citizens' Initiative. One of the major impediments is the huge, again, signatures required, huge number of signatures required, which is 400,000 signatures that have to be collected in 90 days. And the turnout requirement is high and floating. It phrases as at least the number of voters who have voted in previous parliamentary elections. So far, there has been only 3 national referendums in Bulgaria, and none has been successful. That means that not a single issue has been directly decided by citizens in last half a century. However, on the local level, there are citizens' initiative instruments, and there are some success stories. One example being the initiative that stopped gold concession and didn't allow for a mine opening in the small province. Instead, people there are now developing bioagriculture. Thank you very much.
Yes, and thank you, Anna, for this very interesting presentation, going over the different direct democracy instruments that are available and that used to be available and that hopefully will be available in the region in the future. We can talk about that in more detail later, but now I would like to welcome Sasha Zuryan, our activist originally from Ukraine, but based now in Georgia. She works for, or she has founded World of Tolerance. It's an NGO, an NGO focusing on young people, on youth participation and sort of rekindling the fire of democracy also in younger generations. So thank you very much for joining us, Sasha. And yeah, please tell us a little bit more about what democracy means to young people in the region, in Georgia, in Ukraine. And the region in general, and how civil society works over there.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction. And well, as my colleagues previously tackled more of legislative and well, more technical mechanisms, I, as a grassroots activist, will mostly speak about the perspective of a grassroots activist. And well, first of all, I would like to give a brief overview of the context in which the civil society exists right now in Georgia. And yeah, as Caroline mentioned, I am Ukrainian, but for the last 5 years, I have been living and working mostly in Georgia, even though I also work with Ukrainian activists and sometimes physically in Ukraine. For example, right now I'm physically in Kiev. Yeah, but the context of Georgia is something that I am a little bit more deeply involved in. So I'm going to speak a little bit about that. So yeah, during the last few years, and also on the sidelines of Russian full-scale invasion into Ukraine, the European integration processes accelerated a lot in Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. And among the three countries, Georgia was the only one who hasn't received the candidate status. And the European Union Commission presented 12 recommendations to the state to be fulfilled in order to receive the status. And one of these recommendations requires a bigger inclusion of civil society and civil society organizations, in particular in decision-making processes. But unfortunately, as we can see, instead of empowering them and instead of giving civil society actors, individual activists and the organizations more space in the public discussion, we have a situation now in which different political powers and the proxy powers that they are working through. For example, we have this radical far-right movement, Alt-Info, that is posing as independent. However, there are lots and lots of evidence that they're actually connected to certain political powers who are trying to undermine the civil society and even the international community who is supporting Georgia right now in the process of obtaining the status of European Union candidate. For example, there have been different occasions in which foreign diplomats were verbally accused by the government representatives, the representatives of quite powerful civil society feminist organizations were accused of being the promoters of foreign values and so on. So yeah, we cannot ignore the factor of unfortunately, our government trying to play a double game in that way, and this is one of the biggest challenges for the civil society right now. And yeah, in March 2023, for example, this tension between the government and the civil society exploded into huge protests following the fortunately for now, not the adoption, but an attempt to pass a bill on agents of foreign influence, which I think for people acquainted with the local, with the context of the region, would ring the bell and remind a lot the Russian law on foreign agents. And that would mean that the civil society would become much more limited in their operations, and as well, the reputational risks for civil society organizations would be huge. However, thankfully, the population really consolidated. It was an unprecedented wave of support towards civil society, and a really huge campaign coming from the civil society showing that NGOs, right, such an umbrella term for us, do not only take foreign money, but also do something with this money. And it is not only something that stays only in the bubble, right? It is also infrastructure. It is medicine. It is, I don't know, social support, all kinds of things. And yeah, so these events thankfully gave a lot of hope in the society in general and in civil society in particular, that some change is possible through grassroots activism, some change is possible through peaceful protests, some change is possible through advocacy, communication, and attempts to establish some sort of connection between the civil society and people who might not understand fully enough what civil society does. And yeah, also talking about the local context, it's important to mention the influence of the Russian full-scale invasion in Ukraine onto Georgia, because it also showed an unprecedented wave of solidarity towards Ukrainian people and Ukrainian civil society. And again, unfortunately, not all the views of the population have exactly complied and were the same as the views of the government. For example, there were a lot of people did not agree with reluctance of the government to take any more active action except from condemning the war. for example, imposing the sanctions, or even we had this incident when Georgians wanted to volunteer as to join Ukrainian army, but the government was not letting a special airplane that would fly them out of the country to take off, and it was like a 2-3 day battle basically, and so unfortunately, there were some tensions, but from the side of the people, from the side of civil society, I personally, as a Ukrainian, and my colleagues from Ukrainian civil society have seen a lot of support from Georgian civil society. There have been organizations emerging who were helping refugees with humanitarian aid, with legal issues, psychological support, even people who from Georgia who were trying to help in such way inside of Ukraine, for example, through their own connections. So I think that there was also quite a hopeful message for all of us, both for Georgians and for Ukrainians, as we share a lot of recent and less recent history, and especially in the strive for independence and connected to a democracy. And I think it was a very important sign also to show that we still are very intertwined, interconnected in our values. And for me personally, democracy does not start with mechanisms, but with values, and it can continue with mechanisms, of course, and it should. However, first of all, I think there should be something that we share internally and understand as something inseparable from our lives, right? So yeah, I think for us it was a great sign of the desire to be more democratic, the desire to be more to have equality, to have inclusion, to have sort of all the things that we're kind of striving for. And this was all about the context. And now I just like to briefly describe what my organization does in that context. And so in World of Tolerance, we focus mostly on providing space for dialogue and exchange of experience, capacity building for young activists, mostly from Georgia. We have, for example, this year we held an opinion festival. It's a kind of follow-up on the democracy festivals concept, which I think was born in Scandinavian region. However, it already spread over more than 14 countries, and it is conducted in Ukraine as well for 5 or 6 years, if I'm not mistaken. And World of Tolerance conducted such a festival for the first time in Georgia this year. And we really saw it as a very important project because it allows to unite people from so many different walks of life. For example, we had entrepreneurs, educators, even government agency workers. So we really try to bring it out of our civil society bubble. And the point of it is that everybody can come for free in a free space and join a discussion on a topic that is right now maybe pressing in the society, or at least in some way interesting. And it was quite a success. It was a great pilot, and we hope to continue it, not for 1 year longer, but for many more. And I think that it is really for a place like Georgia that is so polarized, but still with people so opinionated, is very important to create spaces where we can all come and maybe speak about a little bit more neutral topics, but still express our opinions that can be different, which doesn't mean that somebody's opinion is worse or better, right? And another program that is also quite crucial for us is the Activist Lab. It unites activists not only from Georgia, but also from Middle East, Latin America, and Africa and Europe. So quite a lot of continents, yeah, and we are all very different. And within this program, we basically try to create a space for sharing our contexts and trying to figure out how knowing and learning about these contexts can help us solve the issues in our grassroots activism, because grassroots activism in Peru is very different from grassroots activism in Georgia, because the challenges are different. However, we can still exchange some tools, we can still learn from each other, and at least we can get to know each other and understand that there is something beyond our country, beyond our region, and that the world is big, but at the same time quite small. Yeah, so this is one of the programs. And also we work a lot with non-formal human rights education. It can be in very, very different formats, webinars, offline trainings. We have a network of schools and universities who know us and who know our pool of trainers. And they know that they can invite us anytime, of course, free of charge, to conduct a training about tolerance, inclusion, diversity. So all kinds of topics that we work with. Yeah, and within this kind of program, we went to remote regions, to mountainous regions, there where there is a need for something a little bit beyond the school program, but there is not always the possibility. So yeah, I guess that is briefly about what we do and how we try to deal with the challenges that exist in our country, and of course the utmost support to the activists at the front lines, referrals to legal, psychological support programs. We have quite a wide network of organizations who provide such help to activists. So yeah, I guess that's it from my side. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sasha, for this first input. And if you don't mind, I would like to stay with you for a little bit. As all of you have mentioned, you've spoken, all three of you, about the value of democracy, and also you've, in some way or other, all of you have mentioned that people still really believe in democracy, that it is still people's preferred form of government, that there is still hope and optimism about democracy as a system. But I did want to put to you this question, at first specifically to you, Sasha, because you work with young people. So recently the Open Society Barometer, which is a worldwide questionnaire that comes out, found that yes, most people around the world actually do still believe that democracy is the best system, that it's better than a strong leader or authoritarianism, as you've mentioned, Dr. Bidenko. But that there is a very big gap, so that while I believe it's over 71% of the general population believes in democracy as a system, for people under 35, that number drops to 57%. So is there, do you notice that in your work? Do young people believe in democracy less? What can we do to make democracy more suitable for young people, to bring the young people to the table, to the decision-making table? How can we involve young people? How can we win these people back?
Thank you. It's a very interesting and quite a complicated question, in my opinion. I think that any belief, any real passion about something starts only when you directly contribute and when you directly participate in the creation of this, right? Or in the process of this. And by this right now, I mean democracy. If people are reluctant to take part in the decision making, if they do not see that the government, or I don't know, any other power or any other counterpart, even, because sometimes it happens that even our partners do not want to hear us and do not want to fully support us. If young people do not feel that they are listened to, if young people do not feel that they have a channel that they can direct their concerns through, I don't think that they're going to really believe in that it's working, right? So I think our role as a sort of platform or medium between young activists or young people in general and, for example, decision makers should be, so our power, our resources that we have in advocacy, our resources that we have in our projects, even in our budgeting, right? They should be directed at creating these channels, these platforms, these ways for people to communicate their problems with those who are supposed to help them solve these problems. So I think that in countries like Georgia, where technically there are mechanisms for any kind of, I don't know, whistleblowing or telling the concerns to the government, for example, there are such mechanisms, there are such channels, there are websites for municipalities that accept, I don't know, ideas for improvement, that accept questions, etc. However, I think that we should be pushing that a little bit more. And for example, with such a concept like the opinion festival, that this is actually something that could work in the perspective if it becomes, and I hope it does, a big and reputable event in Georgia that maybe not everyone, but at least some people actually know and hear about. I think that it could be a great opportunity for them to just come and say, okay, I'm concerned about this. Can you please listen to me? And if there is a way to draw the attention of those who are supposed to answer these questions, or at least to help kind of facilitate them, I think it can be a success in the end.
And maybe this is then a question that we can also put to Professor Bidenko, Yulia.
Thank you.
How do you see this in the region? What you also have students, you have done comparative research. What is your view on this?
Well, according to the opinion polls in Ukraine and in other countries of the region, so-called democracies under transition, there are exactly young people who are more support the democratic future for their countries. Probably it is due to the Soviet legacy or socialistic legacy, where people were kind of limited in practicing their participation in public life. So there is a kind of particular group of young people who really were trained to be active citizens from the very beginning. Meanwhile, elderly people, they kind of were trained to be more passive and obey the rules. What is interesting here in Ukraine, that it is strongly connected to the identity. For example, among young Ukrainians, more than 50% also consider themselves to be not only Ukrainian citizens, but they consider themselves to be Europeans. And that is why these democratic dreams is strongly connected with the EU accession aspiration. So for Ukrainians now, it is so obvious that on the first hand, the after-war recovery is strongly connected with the EU approximation, and current reforms and demand for reforms, they are also mostly connected with the EU association agreement, its political part, and actually with the reforms which should bring our country closer to the European Union. So I would say that young people in Ukraine, they are more optimistic about both the democratic future and the European future for Ukraine.
Thank you. And then maybe I would like to give the chance also to Anna Proskurina to explain, maybe, do you see a link between this this hope and the instruments that exist and the belief of young people in democracy? Do you think that there is a connection there? Do you think direct democracy could be a factor in this?
Yeah, I first of all believe that there is, of course, a huge connection between people believing in democracy and aspiring to have at least some, if not final, voice on issues, and the demand for a variety of mechanisms. For example, yes, there are no actually working direct democracy tools. However, there is sort of working sorry, the word flew out of my mind, petitioning. There is sort of working petitioning instrument, which is, of course, it sort of is asking authorities to take a look at something. It does not guarantee a result, but at least it is in certain way, a barometer of opinions, and people are pretty actively using it. And I, of course, also am not naive about the Ukrainian nation, and I believe we still have a lot of learning to do ahead of us. But I believe, of course, that step-by-step introduction of direct democracy tools will be warmly welcomed and I think actively used once people from the local level and to the national see that it actually impacts their lives.
Thank you. I have one final question, which is for all three of you, but I suggest that maybe we start with Yulia, because I think you have the overview, and you touched upon it a little bit in your previous answer. I would still like to discuss it in a little more detail. So yes, in this region, of course, we cannot ignore the history that is there and the collapse of the Soviet Union. And over the past 30 years, we've also seen, I believe it was 1 year or 2 years ago, that for the first time in the 30 years that have passed since the collapse of the Soviet Union, we actually have less democracies than before. So before that, we saw a trend that was going upwards. We had more and more democracies, and for the first time, actually in 30 years, we see that trend reversing. And this is something that we, in the jargon, refer to as democratic backsliding. Which means that we have less democracies than we had before. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more maybe about the historic context of that. And also I would really like to hear, so not just in Ukraine, but for the rest of the region, right? The war in Ukraine, of course, has had a big impact. And do you think that this is something that has changed how people perceive democracy and the benefits of democracy also in the region?
Well, I'm not historian here, but still I would like to emphasize as a political scientist that actually some processes in the region were underestimated, probably overshadowed during the past decades. And we can see even from the figure that I demonstrated, that I presented on the very beginning of the webinar, that a lot of countries, they were considered like to be very static in the hybrid conditions. Meanwhile, those processes which developed in Russia, in Belarus, in Azerbaijan, they were kind of tolerated and not justified by the international community the way they should be evaluated. So I just returned from the international conference, and I can see how my colleagues from Russia or from the Western countries, they still whitewashing a lot of processes which are happening there. So I said that these ignorance from the Western communities, from those who are proponents of democracy, probably in these countries, they led to these results. And the other message, I would say, which is not only corresponding to the situation in the region, but probably in the Central Europe or probably in other Western countries, that it is very, I would say, dangerous to take democracy for granted. We can see these processes in Hungary, in Poland, probably up to these past elections, right, where there were some like a more liberal parties elected, but still there are a bad situation with human rights in Hungary, in Turkey, in Armenia, Azerbaijan, in Georgia, probably, because there is still lacking some progress about the LGBTQ rights, and it is not only the one topic which are kind of discussing the minority, lingual minority, ethnic minority rights are also under the question. So my point here is democracy is couldn't be real without Democrats. So we can imagine any country without people who are aware about their rights. I think we cannot imagine this country that way. So it is everyday process. And in countries where people are ready to invest their resources, their time, their own money, their probably efforts, their communicational skills into developing these democratic practices and institutions, like it is in Ukraine, like it is in Baltic countries, like probably it is in Czech Republic. So their democracy is still under development or shows better results. Where people are kind of rely too much on their leaders, but not the institutions, we can see this shrinking for democracy spaces and probably repressions and oppression of human rights.
And I'll put that same question to our other two speakers, Anna or Sasha. Does either of you want to still comment on this? Has the war in Ukraine changed how democracy is perceived, or have people kicked into action in the region? Do you see any differences in other countries as well?
Yeah, I think my competence would be best to speak about Ukraine. And well, in a way, Ukrainians and Ukraine has been fighting for independence and democracy within this independence for at least 400 years. So now when we finally got this opportunity, we are still again fighting against autocracy and against autocratic rule. We are defending democracy at the moment. Of course, in Ukraine, there is, in a way, again, now democratic backsliding, a big portion of which is, of course, of the security versus democracy reasoning. And my strong belief is that after the war is over, the sort of democratic freedoms will be reinstated. And my belief is not blind. I also rely a lot on what I know about Ukrainian people. And I strongly believe that even if not government willingly will do that, then Ukrainians will strongly and by various means demand for that.
Thank you. Sasha, is there anything you would like to add to that?
I think, well, in Georgia, it was more of a highlighting of a problem of decreasing democracy, in my opinion. And I think that the war in Ukraine unfortunately allowed Georgian government to promote certain very anti-democratic ways of dealing with societal problems. And but I don't think that this is a problem that appeared after the war. I think it was more of a green light for some things to be done in the shadow of the big crisis in Ukraine and in the region. And I think that it would have happened one way or another, unfortunately, but it just got highlighted. Right.
Okay, thank you for that. Yes, we would now like to open the floor to questions from our participants. I see that people have been writing things in the chat, and I will pass the mic to Karazin, who will tell us what is going on there and what people are asking us about.
Thank you, Caro. So the first question is from Oba King. His question is, with the global downward trend in voter engagement, does the 50% eligibility help or hurt the instrument? Have there been any initiatives that were successful? I think that this is maybe a question for Anna or Yulia.
Yeah, so regarding the first part, of course, there is a huge debate among civil society and among academics. I believe the 50% eligibility quorum mostly hurts, also because in literature, in academic research, there are numerous examples when, because of this quorum, the decision that would have passed otherwise is not passed, or vice versa, with the same percentage. So this is actually in many cases redundant. However, I completely understand that, for example, in the cases of divided societies, or maybe societies that will still need some time to, take a full-on responsibility with the strong direct democracy tools. This can be debatable, especially in the situation of, unfriendly neighbors trying to fight against the democracy. So it can be somehow the tool for manipulation. So this is kind of, I think, from my personal perspective, can be debatable in issues like territorial sovereignty, constitutional reformations, and things like that. However, I deeply believe that it 100% hurts the instrument when it is an unbinding consultational tool. This is way too much effort for no guaranteed result. And with regard to the second question, if there has been any initiatives that were successful, I assume this is about Ukraine, then unfortunately, in terms of citizens' initiatives, no, there has never been any successful initiative, but there were several successful petitions. The recent one being last year, the petition to legalize the same-sex marriages, which is now, I think, in the legislative process. It is impossible to change the constitution currently because of the martial law, but there are other ways to do it. In terms of other votes, there were several votes labeled as referendums, which were in fact authority votes. Some of them were, for example, the vote on Ukraine's independence in 1991, the approval vote, and some of others are interestingly were held again in 90s in Crimea, Luhansk, and Donetsk regions, which were highly influenced by pro-Russian politicians there, one of whom, and they were concerning Russian language as the second official language and things like that. Of course, peculiar example, one of the main figures for this referendums was out of the office after this vote, escaped to Russia, came back in 2011, and was supportive of the Crimea annexation after 2014. So this is the Ukrainian experience of referendums.
Well, if you let me to jump in here, actually, I'm not the kind of hugest proponent of referenda, to be true. Because I don't believe that you need everybody to vote for particular questions. And the number of referendum is not the sign for me of a real democracy. Here, I'm more proponent for deliberative democracy than a direct one, because when you have a process of consultation before to make any decisions, it's even better that to involve everybody who is not a professional, who is not an expert in particular, questions, especially when it's regard on energy security or other, social policy questions. So it's better to involve people, to be open when decision is under development, to have a more consultation. And here I also the proponent of decentralization, which actually in Ukraine was considered as the one of the most successful reforms, because when you have a lot of questions which could be solved by local government, and they have resources, and they are closer to people, and they are more inclusive, and they are more open or transparent or accountable for people, it's even better than you have kind of regular national referendum on any important issue. So here I'm more proponent of these, decision-making inclusive processes that to engage everyone in final decision kind of voting. Yeah, it's a kind of world trend that turnout is decreasing now. So the engagement of the people is getting lower from one point of view, but let us imagine or let us count how many hours we are spending with our smartphones discussing social issues or exchanging our opinions. So for me, yeah, to voting for politicians on national or local elections is very important, but still when we can hear this community as a group, as individuals or as an expert, it's also very important, and probably our democracies are getting more and more decentralized or horizontal ones. So for me, it's better to have a few advocacy campaign that one insufficient referendum, which could be reconsidered. And if to provide you with some examples of these kind of campaigns, it's kind of a campaign against the usage of tobacco in Ukraine. So Ukraine was one of the first countries in a Black Sea region where the consumption of cigarettes and other products were pretty limited, and children were protected, and it is due to efforts of civil society. And the other very successful campaign is Invisible Voters in 2015, when IDPs, internally displaced people, get the right to vote for local elections and to be more involved in political life of the hosting communities. So there are plenty other successful stories for advocating some decision on national or local level, and I think these initiatives are even more democratic than having one referendum once a year or something like that. Thank you.
I don't know, Anna, if you would like to comment maybe a little bit on also the possibility of interplay between campaigns like this and the different kinds of referendums, because you briefly mentioned it in your presentation, but maybe that makes sense to distinguish here between a citizens' initiative and an authority referendum, maybe shortly.
Yes, so at least in case of Ukraine, there are no such thing as authority referendums in our legislations. So there are only mandatory votes, such as change of constitution or some international treaties that alter the territory, and those votes are triggered by the law. And there are citizens-initiated referendums that, of course, are in at least an ideal world, are supported with sufficient time for campaigning. And those would be the votes, of course, triggered by citizens on the issues that are important for citizens. And they would include redrafting the law or drafting a law proposal that would be voted on, and campaigning for that. Again, in an ideal world, not in 60 days period, would raise a strong informational campaign. And again, some consultational bodies are already established in Ukrainian governmental structures. For example, this All Ukraine referendum law was drafted in cooperation with civil society organizations. Yet, since it was not very discussed in public, the law ended up the way it is, which is not very sufficiently working. So, of course, I believe in both of those tools. Referendums are a strong tool for people to make ideally final say on things. But even unsuccessful referendums, when initiated by citizens, raise awareness and raise a huge campaigning wave, which is of course important.
Thank you for that. We are continuing to take questions from the audience in the chat, so please feel free to write more questions in here. But I would like to take a moment, as I mentioned when we started this webinar. This webinar series is sponsored by Engagement Global and the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. For that, we actually need some information of the participants in this Zoom room. So we will be launching a poll. It's a very quick questionnaire asking you your age and if you're affiliated to any civil society organizations. So while we continue with the questions, please take some time to fill out the poll. We'll take a couple of seconds now, and in the meantime, please also feel free to write your questions in the chat.
Okay, then we can continue with the next question. The next question or comment is from Paul. He said, it should be remembered that in the relationship between state and civil society, even if the state which accepts representative democracy and accepts direct democracy, it will defend state interest, which is not necessarily the interest of civil society. Further, it will limit the scope of direct democracy. So that lid will not be against state interests. Is anybody of you have a thought of that or would like to react to that?
Well, I would like to add here that in the region, civil society consider itself to be as the kind of opponent for a state. So it's not only to engage people in some activities in the neighborhood, which is very common for Germany, for example, where civil society is considered to be more kind of a very first step to your public activities. But normally, if you are interested in influencing the political life, you are joining political party, right? And you're becoming a political activist. In Ukraine, I would say in Georgia, for many cases, in Romania, in Moldova, there were other points of development for civil society, because civil society, unlike political parties, which considered to be corrupted or supported by oligarchs, civil society, it was the agent of changes and also the monitor and controller for state actions. So really there are kind of tensions or tension between civil society and the state in this region, and mostly there are think tanks and civil society organizations who supposed to be the most proponents of the democratic reforms in these states. But it is very important not also to counterpart, but to cooperate. And the war in Ukraine was I would say, instrumental here, because a lot of volunteers, they began to cooperate with the state in this case of emergency. So it's very important to have people from civil society in the state institutions, in government, in parliament. That is why civil society is not only the main player to control the government, but also it's a great kind of place to recruit people from the civil society to parliament, to local governments, and so on and so forth. So it's not necessarily the opposite interest, but of course in this particular region, civil society is playing crucial role in providing more transparency for government, I would say, to make this pressure.
Yes, and Sasha, I believe you also have a lot of experience with civil society as sort of the fourth estate or the fourth power. Also in Georgia, I believe you were speaking about protests before. Could you maybe talk a little bit about sort of this interplay between government and civil society, and then the role civil society takes on in Georgia and in the region?
I think so far, unfortunately, it is more of a battle, but we're moving towards making it a partnership. And I think that ideally that is what civil society should strive for, to not be necessarily against the government, or, well, in general, not to be against anything, but to try to consolidate people around some better cause and some positive change. So I think so far in Georgia, it is more of civil society is not opposing, but trying to defend itself from the government's accusations very often. However, I think that still it is very strong. It is quite consolidated. It can be even more consolidated in times of crisis. So I think that we have quite a good perspective of actually becoming more friendly with the government and more cooperative with the government. But of course, it doesn't have to come only from one side, but also from another. Thank you.
Thank you. And then we are no longer receiving questions in the chat. But before we leave you to your Thursday evenings, I would like to ask you if you could all very briefly can give me a short sort of glimmer of hope or a positive message on what can we do, right? So we are joining you from different countries and different continents even. So what can we do to promote democracy, to make sure that we live in a more just and more democratic world wherever we are? So what can we learn from the Black Sea region? What can we learn from you? And how can we ensure that we have better and stronger democracies everywhere? Whoever would like to go first, feel free.
Well, as I said before, do not take democracy for granted. It's my first suggestion, because in my country, in Ukraine, people are really fighting for this in many senses. And for my generation, I started with the Orange Revolution, being a very, very young student, you know. Then I took part in Euromaidan, and now we are facing the full-scale invasion. So it is really important for most of Ukrainians to have their country independent and democratic. And that is why people kind of even sacrificing their lives. So be brave. The second is, I would say, have some values, and it's very important not only to have values you believe in, but to act according to your values. Because we can see from the region, when people are not afraid to do something for their neighbors, for the people they don't know, even for IDPs who come in to their communities from the war zone. They sacrifice in, they donate in, they invest in their time and possibilities. They provide their own property for these people. So when you can act according to your values, you are also part of this democratic future. And the third, be optimistic, because despite all the problems and the issues and challenges Ukraine, Georgia are facing, or they face it in Moldova as well, these people are still believe that their future in the European Union, that they need to work harder, but it is possible for them. So be optimistic, and when you live in according and acting according to your values, when you have principles and you have solidarity with others, probably those people you have never met, it is still possible to make the world a better place.
Thank you for that. That's a very nice message. Anna, please go ahead.
First of all, I would completely agree with everything Yulia said before. And from my side, I would just add, educate yourself, open conversations, and when speaking to people, always keep an open mind to what people from different parts of the world are experiencing. Try to find common ground, common language, and maybe common sense in what each of you are saying. I think true open system and true democratic union starts from hearing and listening to each other.
Wonderful, thank you. Sasha, closing words from your side.
Yeah, I'll try to be as brief as possible. I would say that we should remember that change doesn't come quickly usually, and also doesn't come easily, but it doesn't mean that we should lose our faith and believe that it is actually possible. And if we're true to ourselves and to our values, as also Yulia and Anna said before, it will never change. And therefore, we will change the world for a bit better.
Thank you for that. Yes, and thank you for a very interesting session today, focusing on youth and participation in Ukraine, Georgia, and the Black Sea region. The only thing that is left to me now is to invite you to our next session. So as I mentioned, this is part of a series. We will continue from now on every Wednesday at the same time. It's 5:30 European time, Central European time. And next week we will talk about Tunisia and the Middle East and the Northern African region, specifically when it comes to human rights and defending the rights of minorities in democracy. So that will be a very interesting discussion, to which you are all very welcome to join. You can find the if you register on our website, democracy.community, you will find the link there to join us in Zoom next week. And thank you very much to our wonderful speakers for sharing these insights on what is certainly a complicated situation and a very challenging situation, and especially for finding some hopeful messages in there yet. And I hope that we can all take that with us and into our work and into our futures. Thank you so much, and have